Get out, old man. Find somewhere else to die. My daughter-in-law spat venom, claiming my son's $22 million mansion as her own, days after his funeral. She thought she'd won it all, but when the lawyer smirked, "Did you even read the will?" her face drained of color. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The door exploded open, hitting the wall so hard that my late wife's jewelry box rattled on the dresser. I jerked upright from where I'd been lying fully clothed for 3 days, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Zephyr stood in the doorway, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood as she stepped into my bedroom without invitation. Her black dress was perfectly pressed, not a wrinkle to suggest she'd spent even 5 minutes grieving my son. The funeral flowers downstairs were already wilting, and here she was, pristine as a magazine cover. "Wilburn, we need to talk, right now." I fumbled for my glasses on the nightstand, my hands trembling. The world had been a blur since Tuesday when they lowered Theron into the ground. Everything felt distant, muffled, like I was underwater watching life happen above me. She began pacing the length of my bedroom, her purse clutched tight against her side. Each step echoed with purpose, predatory and calculated. I could smell her expensive perfume cutting through the stale air of my grief. "Zephyr, what? No." She whirled to face me, one manicured finger raised like a weapon. "You listen. I've been patient long enough. 3 whole days I've waited out of respect for your feelings. But that's over now." The afternoon light streaming through the windows caught the hardness in her eyes. This wasn't the woman who had smiled sweetly at church gatherings, who had kissed Theron goodbye each morning with theatrical affection. This was someone else entirely. I struggled to sit properly, my back aching from days of lying motionless. Family photos lined the dresser behind her. Theron as a baby, his graduation, our last Christmas together. She glanced at them with the same expression most people reserve for expired milk. "Find somewhere else to die, Wilburn. Nobody needs you anymore." The words hit me like ice water. I blinked at her, certain I'd misheard. Surely grief was playing tricks with my hearing, making her voice sound cruel and foreign. "I don't understand what you're—" "Oh, you understand perfectly." She resumed her pacing, gesticulating with sharp, impatient movements. "This house, this life you're clinging to, it's not yours anymore. It never really was it? Theron paid for everything. The mortgage, the utilities, your medications, your food." My chest tightened. Yes, Theron had been generous, insisting on covering expenses after I retired. He'd made it sound like gratitude, like payment for raising him alone after his mother died. But in Zephyr's mouth, it sounded like charity I'd stolen. He was my son. Was. The word came out sharp as broken glass. Past tense. He's dead, and you're still here taking up space, breathing air, consuming resources. Do you think that's what he would have wanted? For you to be a burden on his widow? She stopped pacing and fixed me with a stare that could have frozen summer. Her fingers drummed against her purse, a rapid tattoo of impatience. Behind her, the photograph seemed to mock me. All those years when I'd thought we were a family, when I'd believed love meant something more than legal documents and bank accounts. "You have 2 days." Her voice dropped to a whisper, somehow more terrifying than her earlier shouts. 2 days to pack your things and disappear. Find a nursing home, find a cardboard box, I don't care. But you will not be here when I return. She reached into her purse, her movements precise and businesslike. Papers rustled as she withdrew a thick manila envelope, the kind lawyers used for important documents. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in my bedroom, cutting through the suburban afternoon, quiet like a scream. My hands clutched at the bedsheets, trying to anchor myself to something solid as the world tilted sideways. This couldn't be happening. Not 3 days after I'd buried my only child. Not in the house where I'd raised him, where every creaking board held memories of his laughter. But Zephyr was already unfolding papers with the efficiency of someone who'd planned this moment carefully. The papers crackled as she spread them across my bedspread, like cards in a deadly game. Legal letterhead, official seals, signatures I didn't recognize. My vision blurred without my glasses, but the numbers were clear enough. $22 million. This house is worth $22 million. She tapped the appraisal document with one perfectly manicured nail. Can you imagine? 22. And that's just the real estate. There's the business, the investments, the insurance policies. I tried to focus on the documents, but the figures swam before my eyes. Theron had never mentioned such astronomical sums. Yes, his tech company had done well, but $22 million for this old house seemed impossible. We'd bought it 30 years ago for $60,000. The neighborhood gentrified around you, Wilburn. All those young professionals moving in, tearing down the old places, building their glass monuments. Your little time capsule became premium property, and you never even noticed. She gathered the papers and waved them in front of my face like a fan, close enough that I could smell the expensive paper, see the embossed gold seals. Her wedding ring caught the light. Theron's grandmother's diamond, the one he'd insisted she wear. Theron was always too kind to you. Her voice carried a note of fond exasperation, as if discussing a child's poor spending habits. Paying for everything, never asking you to contribute, treating you like some precious relic instead of the burden you really are. But he's dead. The words landed like physical blows. I pressed my hand against my chest, where a sharp pain was building. Each breath felt labored, insufficient. The room seemed to contract around me, the walls pressing closer with each revelation. She moved around the bedroom with the confidence of ownership, examining my late wife's jewelry box, running her fingers along the windowsill, calculating value with her eyes. Everything I'd thought was mine, everything I'd planned to pass down to grandchildren who would never exist. It was all hers now. I have plans for this money, and you're not in them. Zephyr, please! I struggled to sit straighter, my voice coming out as a wheeze. Surely there's enough for both of us. I don't need much. Just a room, somewhere small. She laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. A room? Do you have any idea what I can do with $22 million? The properties I can buy? The life I can build? The last thing I need is some decrepit old man following me around like a lost dog, reminding everyone of my brief mistake in marrying beneath my potential. The cruelty was breathtaking in its purity. She wasn't even pretending anymore, wasn't bothering with the sweet smiles and honeyed words she'd used when Theron was alive. This was her true face, revealed now that she no longer needed to perform. But the lawyers, surely there are laws about abandoning family? Oh, Wilburn! She leaned forward, her perfume overwhelming in the small space between us. I am his next of kin, his spouse. You're just the father-in-law, and not even a particularly useful one. Everything goes to me unless he specifically wrote otherwise, and darling Theron was far too trusting to think he needed protection from his loving wife. She straightened and smoothed her dress, checking her reflection in the mirror above my dresser. Behind her image, I could see myself, rumpled, unshaven, looking every one of my 68 years. The contrast was stark. Youth and beauty and ruthless ambition versus age and grief and mounting desperation. I'll be back Friday evening to inspect your progress. She folded the papers and tucked them back into her purse with military precision. I expect every trace of your pathetic existence to be gone. Clothes, medications, that ugly recliner downstairs, those maudlin photo albums. Everything. She paused at the doorway, one hand on the frame. And Wilburn, don't even think about fighting this. I have lawyers, resources, connections. You have nothing but sentiment, and sentiment doesn't pay legal fees. The click of her heels faded down the hallway, followed by the slam of the front door that shook the entire house. I sat in the sudden silence, staring at the indentation her papers had left on my bedspread, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. My son was dead, and his wife had just sentenced me to homelessness with the casual efficiency of someone discussing dinner plans. The silence after she left felt different from the quiet of grief. This was the silence of abandonment, of a world suddenly emptied of everything I'd thought was secure. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the doorway where she'd stood, her words still echoing like gunshots in an empty cathedral. $22 million. The number rolled around in my mind, too large to grasp. I'd lived my entire adult life in this house, watched it age around me, never imagining it had become a fortune. The creaking stairs, the draft from the kitchen window, the loose board in the hallway, all of it worth more than I could have earned in a dozen lifetimes. My hands shook as I reached for the glass of water on my nightstand. It had been sitting there since Tuesday morning when the funeral director's assistant had brought me home and suggested I rest. 3 days ago, when I still believed I was part of a family. The house felt enormous around me now, every room suddenly foreign. Downstairs, I could hear the grandfather clock chiming 4 o'clock. Theron had wound it every Sunday without fail, a ritual he'd inherited from his mother. Now, it would run down in a week, its hands frozen at some arbitrary moment, marking the death of routine as surely as his burial had marked the death of love. I stood on unsteady legs and walked to the window. The October afternoon was crisp and bright, the kind of day Theron had loved for his weekend bike rides. Neighbors were returning from work, pulling into driveways of houses probably worth millions I'd never suspected. Mrs. Patterson next door was tending her prize-winning roses, oblivious to the fact that the old man she waved to each morning was about to vanish. The medication bottles on my dresser caught the afternoon light. Blood pressure pills, arthritis medication, the antidepressants I'd started after Margaret died. Theron had paid for all of it through his insurance, never mentioning the cost, never making me feel like charity. But Zephyr was right about one thing. I had consumed resources, lived on his generosity, accepted his care without question. Had I been a burden? Had my son supported me out of duty rather than love? The possibility cut deeper than Zephyr's cruelty because it carried the sting of truth. I moved through the house like a ghost visiting his former life. The living room where Theron and I had watched football every Sunday. The kitchen where he'd insisted on cooking elaborate meals whenever he visited, claiming he needed to practice. The study where he'd helped me organize Margaret's papers after the funeral, his presence a comfort against the bureaucracy of death. Every photograph seemed to mock me now. Family vacations, Christmas mornings, graduation celebrations, all the moments I'd treasured as evidence of our bond. But maybe I'd been seeing what I wanted to see. Maybe Zephyr had been there all along, calculating, waiting, counting the days until she could cash in her investment. The phone rang, startling me back to the present. I let it go to voicemail, as I had with every call since the funeral. The machine clicked on, Theron's voice, cheerful and confident, asking callers to leave a message. Another ghost in a house suddenly full of them. 2 days. 48 hours to dismantle a lifetime. To find somewhere for a 68-year-old man with limited income and no living relatives. The social security checks Theron had never let me worry about suddenly seemed pitifully small. Nursing homes, assisted living facilities, studio apartments in neighborhoods where gunshots punctuated the night. All of it would consume my meager resources within months. I made my way downstairs to the living room, drawn by the need for movement, for escape from the suffocating familiarity of my bedroom. The house creaked around me with the settling sounds of evening. I sank into Theron's favorite armchair, the one he'd claimed during every visit home, where the leather still held the faint impression of his body. But as I sat there, watching the shadows lengthen across the hardwood floors, something else began to take shape beneath the despair. A small, hard kernel of something that felt suspiciously like anger. 45 minutes had passed since Zephyr's departure, and I remained frozen in Theron's chair, staring at the graduation photo on the side table. My son in his cap and gown, grinning with the confidence of a young man who believed the world was full of possibilities. I picked up the frame with trembling fingers, tracing the outline of his face through the glass. I remembered the fire. 3 years ago, my little house on Maple Street had gone up like kindling. Faulty wiring, the insurance investigator said. 60 years of memories reduced to ash in less than 2 hours. I'd stood on the sidewalk in my pajamas, watching everything I owned disappear into orange flames when Theron arrived. He'd wrapped me in a blanket and driven me to this house without a word about permanence or temporary arrangements. The next morning, he'd appeared in the guest room doorway with a cup of coffee and that gentle smile that reminded me so much of his mother. "Dad, please move in with us permanently," he'd said, settling the coffee on my nightstand. "You know what I realized last night? A house without family is just walls and a roof. We need you here. Not charity. Need." The word had wrapped around my broken heart like medicine. The success of his software company had come gradually, then all at once. TechFlow Solutions, he'd called it. Some kind of program that helped businesses manage their digital workflows. I'd never fully understood the technical details, but I understood pride. The pride in his voice when he'd shown me the first office lease, the excitement when they landed their first major contract, the quiet satisfaction when the business magazines started calling him innovative and visionary. Zephyr had appeared during the second year of success, all glossy hair and strategic smiles. She'd charmed Theron completely, playing the role of supportive partner, while her calculating eyes assessed everything around her. I'd seen glimpses of coldness back then, the way she'd counted wedding gifts, the casual dismissal of his friends who weren't useful to her social climbing. But Theron had been so happy, so thoroughly convinced he'd found his soulmate. "She makes me want to be better," he'd told me once, showing me the engagement ring he'd bought. "She sees potential in me that I never knew existed." What she'd seen was dollar signs, investment opportunities, a ticket to the lifestyle she'd always believed she deserved. The sound of footsteps upstairs broke my reverie. Zephyr was moving around up there, probably inventorying her newly acquired kingdom. The irony was crushing. She'd married my son for his money, and now his death had delivered exactly what she'd wanted all along. No inconvenient husband to consider, no bothersome father-in-law to tolerate. Just pure, liquid wealth. But something nagged at me, a persistent whisper in the back of my mind. Theron had been methodical about everything: his business, his finances, his future plans. He'd updated his insurance policies annually, maintained detailed investment records, even hired an accountant to handle his taxes. Would such a careful man really have died without making any provisions for his father's welfare? The grandfather clock chimed 5 times, marking another hour in this nightmare. Outside, the October evening was painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the kind of sunset that used to make Theron grab his camera for impromptu photography sessions. He'd inherited that artistic eye from his mother, along with her kindness and her stubborn belief that people were basically good. Margaret would have known how to handle Zephyr. My late wife had possessed an uncanny ability to see through surface charm to the motivations beneath. "That woman's heart is made of spreadsheet cells," she would have said, fixing Zephyr with the stern look that had once reduced our teenage son to confessions and promises of better behavior. I set the graduation photo back on the table and stood slowly, my joints protesting the movement. The anger I'd felt earlier was still there, but it had evolved into something more focused. Not rage at the universe or self-pity about my circumstances, but a quiet determination to face whatever came next, with the dignity Theron would have expected from his father. Whatever secrets this house held, whatever provisions my careful son might have made, tomorrow I would begin to find them. I'd spent the night sleepless, but with growing resolve. By 9 the next morning, I stood in my bedroom with 2 open suitcases, methodically folding the clothes that had seen me through retirement, widowerhood, and now abandonment. Each item carried memories: the sweater Theron had given me for Christmas, the shirt I'd worn to his wedding, the jacket that still smelled faintly of Margaret's perfume from our last dance together. The television in the corner had been mine long before Zephyr entered our lives. I'd bought it in 2019, 6 months before Theron met her, specifically for my bedroom, so I could watch the morning news without disturbing anyone. The receipt was probably still in my filing cabinet downstairs, along with the warranty papers and setup instructions I'd never thrown away. I unplugged the TV and wrestled it onto the dresser, preparing to carry it to my car. The thing was heavier than I remembered, and my 78-year-old arms weren't what they used to be. But it was mine, purchased with my own Social Security money, and if I was being expelled from this house, I'd take what belonged to me. "Stop! You cannot take the furniture!" Zephyr's voice cracked like a whip from the doorway. She strode into my bedroom, wearing yesterday's designer dress, her hair slightly mussed, looking like she'd slept in her clothes. Good. I hoped she'd been as uncomfortable as I'd been. "It's not furniture," I said quietly, not turning around. "It's my television. Everything in this house belongs to me now. Put it back." I faced her then, the TV still in my arms, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt steady, centered. The trembling in my hands had stopped, replaced by something that felt remarkably like strength. "I purchased this television on September 15th, 2019, I said, my voice calm and clear. 6 months before you married my son. The receipt is in my filing cabinet downstairs, along with the warranty registration I filled out in my own handwriting." Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. She'd grown accustomed to steamrolling over my grief and confusion. But this was different. This was facts and documentation, things that could be verified. "You can't prove that." "I can prove it easily." I set the TV down carefully and looked her straight in the eye. Would you like me to retrieve the paperwork? Or perhaps we should call the store and request a copy of the transaction. I have the credit card statement somewhere, with my name on it, dated weeks before you ever set foot in this house." For a moment, she said nothing. I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the risk versus reward of challenging me on something that could be definitively proven. Her confidence was built on intimidation and my assumed helplessness, not on actual legal ground. "Fine," she snapped finally. "Take your ancient television, but everything else stays." "Everything else that belongs to you, yes." I picked up the TV again, my back protesting, but my resolve holding firm. "But I'll be taking my personal belongings, my clothes, my medications, and anything else I can document as mine. If you'd like to challenge any specific item, we can discuss proof of ownership." She stepped aside as I carried the television past her, heading for the stairs. The small victory felt enormous, not because of the TV itself, but because for the first time in 3 days, I'd stood my ground and won. The tremor in my voice was gone, replaced by the steady tone of a man who remembered what dignity felt like. By noon, my car was loaded with everything I could legitimately claim: clothes, medications, a few photographs, some books, my toolbox from the basement, and yes, the television I'd fought for. Zephyr had watched from the window as I made trip after trip, her face a mask of barely contained fury. I'd left behind everything that belonged to the house: the furniture Theron had chosen, the dishes we'd shared meals from, the garden tools he'd used to plant the roses his mother had loved. But I'd taken my dignity, and that felt like victory enough. The engine started on the first try, and I pulled out of the driveway without looking back. After loading my car, I'd driven to the cheapest place I could find, the Midwest Inn, a tired motel squatting beside I-90, like a relic from a more optimistic era. $28 a night for a room that smelled of industrial disinfectant and decades of other people's disappointments. But it was clean, the lock worked, and the clerk hadn't asked questions when I'd paid cash for 3 nights. Now, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flickering neon sign outside my window. Vacancy, in pink letters, with the V stuttering like a nervous heartbeat. Highway traffic hummed past in an endless stream, carrying people toward destinations I couldn't imagine. This morning, I'd been Wilburn Hayes, temporary resident of a $22 million house. Tonight, I was just another old man in a roadside motel, wondering how his life had shrunk to fit inside 2 suitcases. My phone rang at 6:30, the sound jarring in the small space. Unknown number, local area code, probably a scam call or some bill collector who'd tracked me down already. But something made me answer. "Is this Wilburn Hayes?" The voice was professional, measured, not the casual friendliness of a telemarketer or the aggressive urgency of debt collection. "Yes, this is Wilburn." "Mr. Hayes, my name is Urban Caldwell. I'm an attorney here in Chicago, and I represented your son, Theron. I need to meet with you tomorrow morning regarding his estate." I nearly dropped the phone. Estate? Attorney? Theron had never mentioned having a lawyer, at least not beyond the general counsel his company used for business matters. "I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell, but I think there's been some mistake. My son's widow has already informed me that everything goes to her as his spouse. There's no need for lawyers or estate meetings." A pause, then something that might have been a suppressed chuckle. "Mr. Hayes, I need to inform you that your son executed a comprehensive will and testament with my firm in March of this year. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, I'll be conducting a reading of that document. Your presence is required." The room seemed to tilt around me. A will. Theron had made a will at 42 years old, in the prime of his life, with no warning of the heart attack that would kill him 7 months later. But why would he? He was so young, so healthy. "Your son was a prudent man, Mr. Hayes. He understood that successful business owners have responsibilities that extend beyond their own lifespans. Can you be at my office tomorrow at 10? I'm located downtown at 435 West Monroe, Suite 1204. I fumbled for the motel notepad, scribbling the address with a pen that barely worked. "Mr. Caldwell, what does the will say? Can you tell me?" "Tomorrow, Mr. Hayes. Everything will be explained tomorrow. And Mr. Hayes?" His voice took on a slightly warmer tone. "I think you'll find the meeting illuminating." The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long moment, then at the address I'd written in shaky handwriting. 435 West Monroe, downtown Chicago, in the heart of the legal district where million-dollar decisions were made every day. A will. My careful, methodical son had made provisions I'd never dreamed of, had taken precautions against a future none of us had seen coming, and somehow this Urban Caldwell had known exactly where to find me, had tracked me down to a $28 motel room within 24 hours of my exile. I looked around the cramped space that had been my world for less than a day. The cracked mirror, the threadbare carpet, the window that wouldn't quite close properly. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock, I would discover what my son had really left behind. After hanging up, I'd tried to eat the vending machine sandwich I'd bought earlier, but my appetite had vanished completely. The questions circled in my mind like vultures, each one raising 3 more in its wake. I lay on the narrow bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, while the air conditioning unit wheezed and rattled in its desperate battle against the October humidity. Why would a healthy 42-year-old man make a will? Theron had been meticulous about business planning, yes, but a will seemed so final, so morbid for someone with decades of life ahead of him. Unless he'd known something, unless there had been signs I'd missed, symptoms he'd hidden to spare me worry. The traffic on I-90 created a constant white noise, punctuated by the occasional rumble of 18-wheelers heading toward destinations unknown. In the room next door, someone was watching television, canned laughter bleeding through the thin walls, a mockery of my sleepless anxiety. I pulled out my wallet, fishing through the accumulation of receipts and expired insurance cards until I found what I was looking for. Theron's business card, creased from years of proud carrying. Theron Hayes, CEO, TechFlow Solutions. The logo was simple, elegant, a flowing arrow that suggested progress and efficiency. He'd been so proud when he'd first shown me these cards, fresh from the printer, smelling of possibility. "Look at this, Dad," he'd said, running his thumb along the embossed lettering. "My name, my company. Can you believe it?" I could believe it. Theron had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to see 3 steps ahead of everyone else. In high school, he'd started his own computer repair service 2 years before anyone else thought of it. In college, he'd developed software solutions before his professors even assigned the problems. That forward-thinking nature, that instinct for preparation. Of course, he would have made a will, but what could be in it that required my presence? Surely any father would be mentioned in passing, perhaps left with some sentimental items or a small bequest. The real assets, the house, the business, the millions, all of that would naturally flow to Zephyr as his legal spouse. Except Urban Caldwell's voice had carried something more than professional courtesy. There had been warmth there, even anticipation. Illuminating, he'd said, not informative or clarifying, but illuminating. The word suggested revelation, the shining of light into dark places. I got up and paced the narrow space between the bed and the bathroom door, my bare feet silent on the worn carpet. Outside, the neon sign flickered with mechanical persistence, casting pink shadows that danced across the ceiling. The night clerk's radio played softly in the distance, some late-night talk show discussing conspiracy theories and government cover-ups. On the small table by the window, I'd arranged the few personal items I'd salvaged from my former life. A photograph of Margaret and me on our wedding day, both of us impossibly young and certain that love would be enough to overcome anything. A letter Theron had written me from summer camp, age 12, complaining about the food but admitting he was having fun. My father's pocket watch, the only thing of value I'd inherited, its gold case tarnished but its movement still precise after 8 decades. These fragments of a lifetime, scattered across a motel table like evidence at a crime scene. Tomorrow, everything might change again. Or nothing might change, and I'd return to this room to plan the rest of my abbreviated future. But something in Urban Caldwell's tone suggested that tomorrow would bring answers I couldn't yet imagine. Somewhere in that downtown office, sealed in legal documents and witness signatures, lay the truth about what my son had really intended for the people he'd left behind. I climbed back into bed, fully clothed, and tried to quiet my racing thoughts. Tomorrow would come, whether I slept or not. Morning came too soon, and not soon enough. I'd managed perhaps 3 hours of fitful sleep before giving up entirely, showering with the motel's paper-thin towels and dressing in my best suit. The navy one I'd worn to Theron's wedding, pressed in the bathroom steam and smelling faintly of mothballs and old grief. The drive into downtown Chicago took 45 minutes through morning traffic that moved like congealed blood through the arteries of the city. I'd allowed an extra hour, paranoid about being late, for what might be the most important meeting of my remaining years. The Midwest Inn felt like another lifetime by the time I pulled into the parking garage beneath 435 West Monroe. The building rose 30 floors above the street, all glass and steel reaching toward a gray October sky. In the lobby, marble floors reflected the hurried footsteps of lawyers and executives, their expensive shoes clicking out the rhythm of important business. I felt impossibly small in this cathedral of commerce, my worn suit marking me as clearly as a price tag. The elevator climbed with whisper-quiet efficiency, the numbers above the doors ascending toward my appointment with destiny. Floor 12, 20, 23. When the doors opened, Urban Caldwell's waiting room spread before me like a study in understated wealth, leather chairs the color of old whiskey, mahogany panels that probably cost more than my annual income, windows offering a panoramic view of the city where fortunes were made and lost daily. The receptionist, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, looked up as I approached. "Mr. Hayes, Mr. Caldwell is expecting you. Please, have a seat. He'll be with you shortly." I'd barely settled into one of the leather chairs when the elevator chimed again. Zephyr emerged, resplendent in a black designer suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. Her hair was perfect, her makeup flawless, her expression radiating the confident satisfaction of someone attending her own coronation. She glanced at me with mild surprise, then dismissal. "Wilburn, what are you doing here?" "I was invited," I said simply, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "Invited?" She laughed, the sound sharp as breaking crystal. "This is a legal proceeding about Theron's estate. You don't have any legal standing in—" "Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Hayes." The receptionist's voice cut through Zephyr's objection. "Mr. Caldwell will see you now." Urban Caldwell appeared in his office doorway, tall, distinguished, wearing a charcoal suit that fit like it had been born with him. His silver hair was immaculately styled, his handshake firm but not aggressive, his smile professional but somehow knowing. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes." He shook my hand first, his grip warm and reassuring. "Thank you for coming." Then he turned to Zephyr, his manner subtly cooler. "Mrs. Hayes, please, both of you, come in." His office occupied a corner of the building, with windows on 2 walls offering commanding views of downtown Chicago. The furniture was antique mahogany, the kind that had probably witnessed a century of legal battles and family dramas. Law books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather spines creating a mosaic of accumulated knowledge and precedent. "Please, sit." Urban gestured toward 2 chairs positioned before his massive desk. I took the one on the left. Zephyr claimed the right with the air of someone accustomed to occupying positions of privilege. Urban settled behind his desk and opened a thick file folder, its contents hidden from our view. The silence stretched taut as a violin string, broken only by the distant hum of traffic 23 floors below. Finally, Zephyr's impatience broke the quiet. "Can we get on with this? I have appointments this afternoon." Urban's smile was enigmatic, perhaps even slightly amused. "Of course, Mrs. Hayes, though I suspect you might want to clear your calendar for the rest of the day." Urban leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled before him like a judge considering a particularly complex case. The file folder lay open on his desk, revealing the edges of multiple documents sealed with official stamps and ribbons, but positioned so neither Zephyr nor I could read their contents. "Before we begin the formal reading," he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to controlling important conversations, "I need to ask you both a question. Mrs. Hayes, were you aware that your husband had executed a last will and testament?" Zephyr shifted impatiently in her chair, crossing one leg over the other with sharp precision. "Of course not. Theron was 42 years old and perfectly healthy. Why would he make a will? Besides, it doesn't matter what some piece of paper says. I'm his widow. Everything automatically comes to me under Illinois inheritance law." Urban's eyebrows rose slightly, and I caught the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Is that so? And you, Mr. Hayes, did you know about your son's will?" "Not until you called yesterday," I admitted, still struggling to understand why I was here at all. "I don't know anything about legal matters. I assumed Zephyr was right about the inheritance laws." "Assumptions," Urban said, drawing the word out like a wine connoisseur savoring a particularly fine vintage, can be dangerous things in estate law. Mrs. Hayes, you seem very certain about your legal position. Tell me, have you actually consulted with an attorney about Illinois inheritance statutes? Zephyr's perfect composure flickered for just an instant. I don't need a lawyer to tell me that a wife inherits her husband's estate. That's basic common sense. Common sense. Urban repeated the phrase with the same deliberate care he'd given to assumptions. He pulled a single sheet of paper from the file and held it up, angled so we could see it contained dense legal text but couldn't make out the specific words. Your husband was indeed a very prudent man, Mrs. Hayes. He came to me in March of this year, 7 months before his death, with some very specific concerns about how his estate should be handled. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Zephyr's foot stopped bouncing, and her manicured fingers gripped the arms of her chair with enough force to whiten her knuckles. Specific concerns about what? She demanded, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. Urban's smile widened, and I suddenly understood that this man wasn't just a lawyer. He was a strategist who genuinely enjoyed his work, about ensuring that his assets would be distributed according to his wishes, not according to what others might assume his wishes to be, about protecting the people he truly cared about from those who might see his death as a business opportunity. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Zephyr's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, while I felt something stirring in my chest that I hadn't experienced in days. Hope. What exactly are you implying? Zephyr's voice was tight, controlled, but underneath I could hear the first notes of real fear. Urban set the document back in the file with theatrical precision. I'm not implying anything, Mrs. Hayes. I'm simply preparing to read your late husband's last will and testament, which will speak for itself. Though I will say this, Theron was remarkably prescient about human nature. He reached into the file again, this time withdrawing a thick document bound in blue legal backing. The formal seal of his law firm was embossed at the bottom, and I could see Theron's signature on the final page, bold and confident even in legal documents. Now then, Urban said, his smile broadening into something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. Let me read the relevant portion regarding the family residence. He adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat. Yes, Mrs. Hayes, the house does transfer to you as surviving spouse. However, there is one small condition attached to this bequest. Urban's paws stretched like a taut wire, his eyes moving deliberately from the document to Zephyr's increasingly rigid posture. Her designer heel had begun tapping against the marble floor in sharp staccato rhythms that echoed through the quiet office like a countdown timer. What condition? The words erupted from her lips before Urban had finished his sentence. What kind of condition? Get to the point. Urban's professional composure never wavered, but I caught the glint of something almost predatory in his expression. He was savoring this moment, drawing it out like a master conductor, building to a crescendo. Patience, Mrs. Hayes. Legal documents require precise interpretation. He turned a page with deliberate slowness, his finger tracing lines of text. Your husband was quite specific about the terms under which you would inherit the family residence. Zephyr leaned forward in her chair, her perfectly manicured nails now digging into the leather armrests. The confident woman who had dismissed me as irrelevant was transforming before my eyes into something desperate and grasping. I don't care about legal technicalities, she snapped. The house is worth $22 million. Whatever silly condition he attached doesn't matter because... Because what, Mrs. Hayes? Urban's voice cut through her protest like a scalpel. Because you've already violated it? The words hit her like a physical blow. She actually recoiled in her chair, her face draining of color so rapidly I thought she might faint. The tapping of her heels stopped abruptly, leaving only the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of traffic far below. Violated what? Her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm his wife. I have rights. Urban nodded thoughtfully, as if considering her words. You do indeed have rights, Mrs. Hayes, rights that your husband carefully defined in this document. But rights, like privileges, can be conditional. He lifted the will slightly, tilting it toward the light streaming through the office windows. Would you like me to read the exact language, or would you prefer to continue with your assumptions about inheritance law? I found myself holding my breath, caught between the growing panic in Zephyr's eyes and the barely contained satisfaction in Urban's measured responses. Something monumental was about to happen. I could feel it building like static electricity before a thunderstorm. "Read it," Zephyr commanded, but her voice cracked slightly on the second word. "Read whatever ridiculous condition he put in there, so we can get on with this." Urban's smile had evolved into something that would have looked perfectly at home on a chess master about to deliver checkmate. "Very well, Mrs. Hayes. I shall read the exact language your husband used." He cleared his throat again and began to read in the formal cadence of legal proclamation. "The family residence at 1247 Oak Park Avenue, valued at approximately $22 million, shall transfer to my wife, Zephyr Michelle Hayes, upon my death, subject to the following irrevocable condition. My father, Wilburn James Hayes, shall have the absolute right to reside in said property for the remainder of his natural life, with full access to all common areas and reasonable privacy in his designated quarters." Zephyr's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. But Urban wasn't finished. "Furthermore, should this condition be violated through eviction, harassment, or any action that forces my father to vacate the premises against his will, the entire estate, including but not limited to the family residence, all business assets, investments, and personal property, shall immediately transfer in its entirety to my father, Wilburn James Hayes, as sole beneficiary." The silence that followed was deafening. Zephyr shot to her feet as if the chair had burst into flames beneath her. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll with smudged makeup. Her mouth opened and closed twice before any sound emerged. "What?" The word came out as a strangled whisper. That's impossible. He wouldn't." "Oh, but he could, and he did." Urban's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting months to deliver this particular piece of news. He pulled another document from the file, this one bearing official seals and notarized signatures. "Your husband was quite thorough, Mrs. Hayes. He even had the foresight to establish a monitoring system." Zephyr began pacing behind her chair like a caged animal, her designer heels clicking against the marble with increasing urgency. "Monitoring system? What are you talking about? This is insane. Theron loved me. He loved his father more," Urban said simply. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of undeniable truth. "And he was apparently quite perceptive about your character." I sat in stunned silence, my mind struggling to process what I'd just heard. My son, my careful, thoughtful son, had not only anticipated this exact situation, but had crafted a legal fortress to protect me from it. Even in death, he was still taking care of his old man. "But I'm his wife." Zephyr's voice rose to nearly a shriek. "I have legal rights. You forfeited those rights 3 days ago," Urban interrupted, his tone now carrying the weight of absolute authority. "When you illegally evicted Mr. Hayes from his legal residence and forced him to seek shelter in a roadside motel." He opened yet another folder, revealing photographs and documents I couldn't quite make out from my position. "Your husband anticipated that if you showed your true nature, you would do exactly what you did. He hired a private investigation firm to document any harassment or eviction attempts. They've been monitoring the situation since his death." Zephyr staggered backward, her hand reaching for the chair to steady herself. "You've been watching me. That's stalking. That's illegal surveillance." "It's protecting a vulnerable elderly man from elder abuse," Urban corrected, "and it's completely legal when authorized by the property owner, which, as of 3 days ago, when you violated the will's conditions, is now Mr. Hayes." The full magnitude of what had happened began to dawn on me. Not only was I not homeless, not only could I return to the house I'd thought lost forever, but according to this will, I now owned everything. The $22 million house, Theron's business, all of it. "He never let me down," I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. "Even after death, he never let me down." Urban's expression softened as he looked at me. "Your son spent considerable time crafting these protections, Mr. Hayes. He said family was the most important thing in the world to him, and he wanted to make sure his father would be cared for, regardless of what happened to him." Zephyr collapsed back into her chair, her perfectly styled hair beginning to come undone, her composed facade crumbling like a house of cards in a strong wind. "This can't be happening," she moaned. "This isn't how it was supposed to go. I'm his wife. I loved him." "You loved his money," Urban said with devastating simplicity. "And now it's gone." The transformation in Zephyr was complete and terrible to witness. The polished, calculating woman who had stood in my bedroom 3 days ago, coldly demanding my exile, had dissolved into something desperate and wild-eyed. Tears streamed down her cheeks, cutting tracks through her carefully applied makeup, and her hands shook as she clutched the arms of her chair. "There has to be something," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Some way to challenge this, some loophole. You're a lawyer. Help me find a way around this." Urban's expression remained professionally neutral, but I could see the satisfied justice in his eyes. "Mrs. Hayes, your husband consulted with 3 different law firms when drafting this document. It's absolutely ironclad. There are no loopholes, no grounds for challenge, and certainly no basis for any court to overturn his explicit wishes." She turned toward me then, her face a mask of desperation and barely contained rage. "Wilburn, please. You can't want all of this. Just take the house. Let me have the business, the investments. We can work something out." The plea hung in the air between us, pathetic and grasping. This was the same woman who had told me to find somewhere else to die, who had calculated the value of my son's assets while his body was barely cold in the ground. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only a deep, quiet sense that justice had finally been served. "I don't want anything that belonged to you," I said softly. "I just wanted my son's love and respect." Apparently, I had both. Urban gathered the documents on his desk with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Hayes, I'll need you to come in tomorrow to handle the transfer paperwork. There are several business matters that will require your immediate attention, including the management transition for TechFlow Solutions." The magnitude of it all was still settling over me like a heavy blanket. I owned a multi-million-dollar company now. I, who had spent the last 3 days wondering if I could afford another night in a roadside motel, was suddenly one of the wealthiest men in Chicago. Zephyr stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'll find a way to challenge this. I'll hire the best lawyers in the country. You'll do nothing," Urban said with quiet finality. "Because you have no grounds, no money to hire those lawyers, and no legal standing whatsoever. As of this moment, Mrs. Hayes, you own exactly what you brought into the marriage, which, according to the prenuptial agreement your husband also had you sign, amounts to your personal clothing and jewelry." The prenup. Of course there had been a prenup. My methodical son had thought of everything, had protected himself and his father from every possible angle. Even his love had been careful and strategic. Zephyr's face crumpled completely. She grabbed her purse from the floor beside her chair and stumbled toward the office door. "This isn't fair," she cried, her voice breaking on the words. "This isn't how it was supposed to happen. I'll challenge this in court. But she was already through the door, her heels clicking rapidly down the hallway as she fled from the scene of her complete and utter defeat. Urban and I sat in the sudden quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the city 23 floors below. After a moment, he smiled, not the predatory satisfaction of earlier, but something warmer and more human. "Your son was a remarkable man, Mr. Hayes," he said quietly. "He told me once that family wasn't just about blood. It was about who showed up when life got difficult. He said you'd shown up for him every day of his life, and he wanted to make sure he could show up for you, even after he was gone." I felt tears threatening for the first time since the funeral. He never let me down, not once in 42 years, and not even now. Urban nodded. "He said you'd taught him that being a man meant protecting the people you loved. Seems like he learned the lesson well." Through the wall of windows, Chicago spread out below us in all its autumn glory. And somewhere in that vast city, I had a home waiting for me. Not just any home, but the place where my son had lived and loved and planned for a future that would care for his father long after he was gone. Justice, I realized, sometimes comes dressed in blue legal backing and official seals. But it comes nonetheless. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.